Yeah, we're going to move into this learning conversation. I want it to be, it'll be me and Dorn speaking to one another, but I want, if you all want to be active in the chat, I definitely encourage that. And I want to set it up as a learning conversation. As a person, I'm working on a data governance tool myself with OEDP and the team here. It's called the Community Data Hubs tool, and it's kind of in the research and ideation phase. And I just thought it would be really interesting to talk to someone in a team that was further in their development of a tool that's similar in a lot of ways, but different in a lot of ways. And you all have access to that basic information on the tools themselves. So please reference those docs if you have any questions. They're linked in the landing doc. But yeah, I have a group of questions that I've loosely categorized as general governance and design questions, legal questions, sociocultural questions, and technical questions. I'll start with a few questions, but I want you all involved too, so please put questions in the chat and we'll get to them as the conversation flows. And then you'll have time in the breakout sessions to ask anything, make comment, tell us about your experience. But yeah, from the quick temperature check we did just now, I think we can kind of start at the high governance level and kind of maybe move into more specific sociocultural questions, since that seemed to be an interest. But yeah, Dorn, you ready to chat?
Indeed, I am. Looking forward to it.
Cool. Let's get started. So broadly, what kind of challenges do you think the Ag Data Wallet will respond to in the space that you all work with, and what kind of stakeholders or sectors will it support?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I really think that that's the foundation of what we're addressing is that the environmental concerns that we're addressing are both global and intensely place-based and local. And part of that is sort of sharing and building our global knowledge, sort of commonwealth of agricultural environmental knowledge, and building an understanding of the way the world works so we can better value it and steward it and equip land stewards with the best information, and also policymakers and others in terms of how to make better policy and incentives that actually work on the ground. Meanwhile, again, so that's sort of the global piece, or sort of the large scale piece. So that's very much about sharing information widely. The other aspect of food and agriculture and community management is that it's intensely local, and we have to manage data, community sovereignty, food sovereignty, and sort of the individual enterprises that are actually responsible for creating that public good. So we're both creating private goods and public goods at the same time. And so how do we do both of those things well? And so we and not overburden the land stewards who are responsible for doing a lot of that work and trying to create value that will both sustain them and their enterprises and their communities. So that was sort of the foundation of this, and recognizing that if we're trying to balance those two, that really to build out that large scale collaboration, we have to start with individuals. We're all the people involved in making sure that we're creating a system that is based on trust and consent management, essentially building trust in such a way that all of the ways in which we collaborate are voluntary and opt-in, essentially. And so that really led to the creation, not just of sort of a technical architecture, but as we'll get into, some of the social and legal sort of architectures that we're working along with that. Yeah, so that's the problem that we're trying to solve, is essentially how do we create a mechanism for exchange that builds trust with every step, essentially. And again, we're doing that in an environment where there's a large amount of distrust in the way in which personal data has been handled. And so fundamentally looking at a different way of managing that. And that's sort of the concept of the data wallet. it sort of came out of that, but we're not inventing that. That's very much in reference to other initiatives, the Indian government and their work with DigiLocker in terms of management of personal data, other initiatives like the solid framework that Tim Berners-Lee is working on that creates sort of individual data pods. So we're referencing that, but we think that the ag data wallet is a very particular use case that is relevant to environmental data, environmental markets, and the unique nature of making and exchanging information that's again, as we're seeing, the next value of agricultural products is not just the calories related to the food, fiber, energy, the product itself, but all the attributes that come with it and the values associated with that. So we need a way in which we can facilitate that exchange.
Totally. There's a lot in there that I want to get to, but I'm coming back to a question that we often ask about the community data hubs about, tailoring a tool for individual use versus collective use, and thinking about how these tools can support and will support collective decision making or individual use. I wonder if you all think about that. I know in your question you just
all the time. Yeah, no, I think that's the nature of this. I think it's not an either or. I think we've been designing with the idea that a collective use requires individual consent. And so a lot of our work starts again at the individual, making sure that we create the technical, legal, social structures to grant that consent and maintain trust, but very quickly moving into collaborative agreements. That's one of the very first things that happens, because again, we're talking about fairly complex transactions when we get into this, that just like we've seen in other, when we're dealing with complex markets, you create cooperatives to help manage and create a collective, collective bargaining or more larger power by grouping individuals together to represent that group's interests. So I think it's the same, but it does require that individual level of management to opt in or have the ability to opt in with some nuance. So I think our answer has been it's both, but it's to move as quickly as we can into trusted groups.
Yeah. Taking that trust angle and thinking about, when you're building kind of norms and values into a tool, you want to reflect the user community and, kind of the ethos and, I don't want to say vibe, but, like you want to reflect what's important to the people who are going to be using it. And I'm interested in what values and norms, I know you said trust, respecting individual buy-in. How do those values and norms reflect the user community that you're using and doing in the design of the Ag Data Wallet?
Yeah, no, I mean, in fact, that's a lot of what we're defining as a group, and as the foundational design documents that are being actually created right now. And I think that's probably a question coming up later, but we're working on an Ag Data Bill of Rights that essentially lays out those baseline, in order to grant essentially rights to others, you have to have them, you have to recognize them. And so that's sort of the foundation of like, what do you start with in a transaction? What are your core rights that you're beginning with, so that you can act and that you control, so that you can actually allow for agreements to grant those to others. And again, we're not starting from scratch on that either. There are existing initiatives in the US like the Ag Data Transparent or GDPR principles in more in the rest of the world and in the EU, and we're referencing the Farm Data Code that developed by the National Farmers Federation in Australia. That is all of whom are getting at different aspects of that. But our next goal is really to, based on that work, to have a foundational set of agreed principles. that we're starting from.
And that's the Bill of Rights, right?
That's the Bill of Rights, exactly.
Okay. And you're kind of co-designing that with your user community.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Again, not starting from scratch. There's a tremendous amount of work that's been done on that. Some of already in in legal code in various parts of the world. We're trying to sort of simplify that down in some sense, but then create again that referenceable document that we can, that as a community we can go back to and say these are the kinds of things that we're starting with. That in terms of types of use, the duration, all of those things need to have definitions for us to be able to grant them to others.
Totally. Thinking about like responsible data practices and like the Bill of Rights, what kind of risks and liabilities with personal data protection are you thinking about when you design the wallet? Because I know that that kind of looks different based on sectors. So in the agricultural sector, like what does that look like? Like what are the risks and liabilities there?
Yeah, well, I mean, and it's really interesting for land stewards, farmers, and ranchers all have different perspectives on what those risks are, depending on where you are in the country. But certainly, there's a lot of nervousness about releasing production information or environmental concerns that may bring additional regulation or uh, or create competition in some unexpected ways. But I think the bigger thing is often that there's a desire not to have other third parties profiting off of your information without your knowledge or consent. That's often less, that we've seen that within our community and other polls and direct experience, that's really often the larger motivation, is that there's the perception and reality that this new environmental information has value, and that if it has value, that those that produced it should be the ones who are the primary beneficiaries. So that's sort of the foundation of a lot of this, is like making sure that if there's value, that the right people are actually benefiting from that um, from that information. And so so part of what, and that's again why it comes down to the individual level, is that we have a sort of a mantra within OpenTEAM about enter data once, use it many times. But what that essentially means is that we create environmental statements or attestations that become the source of truth, that all the subsequent transactions or references come back to, so that those that created that initial observation or attestation about what happened where can be referenced and traced back. And there are all sorts of technical ways in which to do that, but that's sort of the fundamental principle.
Yeah, I really like that. Kind of taking like those principles of like reuse and usability and like kind of taking the, I don't know, not the onus or the responsibility, but like making sure that people who are entering their data aren't having to re-enter it, but also being represented when that data is used, right?
Yeah, it does both of those things. And of course, we know the frustration in all sorts of other circumstances dealing with government, especially about multiple data entry and the errors that it creates, and the hassle and perception of inefficiency of bureaucracy and all the rest, which when we're dealing with these kinds of complex markets will kill it. We need to make this easy also. So that's the other piece of the puzzle.
Totally. I mean, we kind of talked about this, but and what the motivations of people to use this, but I'm thinking about buy-in, kind of what it means to have buy-in from people and have buy-in from your data users and people using this tool. Would you say that, kind of the reasons you mentioned before were the main motivators, or you think there are other things as well that play into their decisions and use of the tool?
Well, I mean, I think the use of the tool, maybe could you repeat the question again?
Yeah, sure. Just thinking about like getting buy-in from, people, farmers, people in the agricultural sector that want to use this tool. You mentioned, there's a lot of motivations in protecting data, reducing hassle. I didn't know if there were any other kind of ways or incentives that you all were seeing that were bringing people to want to use it.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a lot of the work that we're currently doing is understanding all of the incentives and motivations at every step. So recognizing that that changing tools or technologies is very difficult, and it's a big ask because there's always learning curves, and especially with new tools, that learning curve is sometimes steep, and we're asking land stewards to learn and provide feedback to us. So providing value from the beginning is incredibly important. So and recognizing that just having tools that work is only one piece of the change equation. We also have to create the skills to use them appropriately. You look at how powerful a spreadsheet is, but to use it requires quite a lot of education and time and training, or QuickBooks, or pick any powerful tool like that. So building, again, the support infrastructure that provides some of that value upfront is a huge part of the equation. Providing seeing successful examples is also incredibly important, and then of course the immediate positive feedback or incentives. And so we're seeing that initially related to having access to better technical support initially, being able to more efficiently get your results back and be able to interpret them for on-farm decisions. So soil health management reports, making government participation in conservation districts or other local, community ag groups easier. And then in the current work that we're doing, using that same information in the wallet, like the universal application for financial assistance or applications to direct assistance programs that may exist in within their country. In our case, working particularly closely with the USDA in the US, to access transition finance programs. So funds to pay producers directly, but like a college application or the universal college application, you enter it once and you can qualify for, or you can automatically apply for lots of programs. And so really reducing the effort required on the producer. And we're also working very closely with other certifications because the administrative burden for doing things like organic certification is fairly high annually. And we're seeing this as another motivation for reducing the labor to maintain certifications. And again, all of those are incentives before we get to environmental markets or contributing to sort of larger collaborative efforts. Those are sort of the individual incremental incentives that we're working on.
Yeah, interesting. I just want to open it up here. If there's any questions from the group, I have more questions, but I just want to have a little break. If anything's sparking for anybody, just feel free to unmute and chat.
Hey, Dorn, I'd love if you could comment a little bit about wicked problems and true cost accounting in this space.
Do you want to say more, Christoph?
I mean, I don't know. I'm a generalist who knows what those things mean, but it's more like true cost accounting is we're not factoring the negative externalities coming out of agriculture.
Yeah.
And, when I think about true cost accounting in this sense, it's how can we look at how much we're healing or harming the land, and having the data to support that.
Yeah.
And then wicked problems, recognizing there are a lot of wicked problems in this space with incomplete information, all sorts of twisted, perverse structures and power dynamics and organic is not organic is not organic. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, well, I mean, I like the direction of this question because I think this gets at some of the core motivations for bringing together sort of agriculture, or sort of what we're looking at here is adding in a lot of those positive externalities and or accounting for negative externalities in the way in which we describe agriculture and our activities. Essentially, agriculture is the way in which we interact and manage our own environment, and that and it has these positive, potentially positive effects that are that, as you said, have not been accounted for, and environmental markets are trying to sort of account for that. But what we're really doing, as you're saying, some of these wicked problems are really decommodifying and recognizing the place-based specific nature of our environmental management. And so, yes, we're producing food, fiber, and energy, but we're also producing all these economic, social, biological benefits that are part of, I like the term sort of fingerprint of every producer on the land, and beginning to account for what nature is doing and how we're adding to that or extracting from it. So I think that's sort of the basic equation that we're looking at, is how do we use these tools of environmental observation, create some credibility with those observations, or those attestations is sort of the term that we use, but not just the land steward's observations, but everybody else who the land steward works with, to create credible descriptions of what changed over time and what our management contribution to that was. I mean, I think that's the very foundation of what we're trying to do here. And the wallet is essentially a way to account for that it's done individually. I think the interesting thing, we get sort of philosophical into this a little bit, but from a practical, even from a data perspective, is that part of the nature of each of us as individuals is we're all mortal, but we're managing these systems that will outlive us. And so we need a way in which we have our attestation, but then describe the natural system that actually extends beyond our own lifetimes and are able to contribute to that multi-generational effort too. So that's sort of, if you're trying to look at sort of big picture, Christoph, and sort of wicked problem, that's one of those things, is that we're dealing, and microbial life cycles are even shorter, right? So we have this range that we're managing. But I think the thing that we're doing is putting ourselves appropriately, sort of scientifically, into that ecosystem appropriately, and starting to build data structures that represent the way nature actually works and our actual role in that.
I see a question from Kate.
Thanks, Emelia. Hi, Dorn. Thanks for having me. My background is primarily in fisheries and ocean systems, so a lot of parallels in terms of supply chains and complex market issues, as well as public resource management there. And I'm curious if, from your data wallet perspective, how you've addressed these challenges of kind of having a single touch entry point that can flow into both regulatory compliance systems as well as optional certification systems, since those regulatory compliance systems are often much stricter about what types of data formats it can receive, and if they'll even take third-party data systems, you have to use their weird app, right? So, to make it easy for the data creator, you often have to have these back-end workarounds to flow into all the systems, and I'm just curious how you're navigating.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, so part of the concept of the data wallet is that also that the data that's stored in the wallet isn't necessarily all user generated, isn't all about the land steward or the environmental steward if you're managing fisheries, but that the value, some of those observations require specific protocols to be entered into a specific format that can then be copied and stored in that wallet. it's a little bit like if you participate in a medical study, the patient isn't actually recording all of their own information. You have qualified individuals running very complex equipment, but you can take your MRI and store it, and you have a copy of that, and that's the official real version of it, even if your doctor also has a copy. It's a little like that. That's not the way our medical system really truly works this way, but that's the way we're imagining the Ag Data Wallet should work, is that when you have a third-party certifier or a trusted advisor who's doing soil tests and following specific protocols and sending them to a lab, you get a copy that is retained, that is the authoritative copy, that you can then decide how you then share it, so that it would be accepted then for certification or for research purposes. And that solves a lot of the issues that we have with, in the research world, they call it sort of the gray data, the data that was collected that may or may not have followed all of the protocols to become published. And our thought, our thesis here is that we can, through these processes and creating structures for those protocols, greatly expand the quality of the data that's accepted and stored in that format.
Awesome. See a couple of questions in the chat. I want to ask Dorn one more question for the big group. Maybe we can hit on those questions in the breakouts. But just one kind of closing before we break out into the groups. Dorn, I'm interested in what lessons or practices, and you kind of hit on this in Kate's question, what lessons or practices can other open tools or other tools that are working on environmental data or fisheries data, what do you think they can like kind of learn and integrate from you all's work on the Ag Data Wallet?
I think there's a broad lesson that we're still learning and working on implementing, which is essentially creating it's sort of this tree metaphor, that we're building a common trunk and that we have branches and leaves which are constantly sort of exploring and innovating, but they're all contributing to a growing common trunk, and developing both our architecture for development processes and iterations and versioning on that basic structure. So we really encourage innovation on the edges while we are consolidating our consensus and agreements on some of the core pieces. And so that's, I think, some of the, again, that's not ag specific, but one of the major things that we've been working on is how do we ask better questions together and share the questions we're asking, because often that's at the root of where we can both agree and collaborate, even if we're asking those questions for different answers we're trying to get out of that same data. So that's a huge point, I think, of intersection where we can build that trunk. And along those lines, I think this constant community versioning process, version and release, is just such a powerful tool to create larger collaborations and not stall us out, so that we have momentum and we're feeling like together we're actually making progress rather than just creating a lot of bureaucracy.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, yeah, so yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I love the tree metaphor. I think it probably resounds for a lot of people in this room. Great. Well, thank you all for your questions. Thank you, Dorn, for answering those so eloquently.